Thank you. Thank you, Ian, for introducing some levity into this, because I'm unusually for myself very nervous about this talk, partly I think because of the awesomeness of this place, partly because it is the first Bob Silver's lecture without Bob, and there's certainly people in this room, probably many people in this room who knew Bob much better than I did, but I owe a huge debt of gratitude to him. Among other things, in addition to being the best editor I ever worked with, he was also the editor who had the funny idea that I could actually comment on American politics. And this has turned out to be a fairly productive enterprise. And I'm also going to speak much more personally than I normally speak, so that probably accounts for some of the nervousness. As I said in my 7 words, the first 7 words, I'm an outliner. So I do have an outline. And number 1 in this outline is fetus. The topic of my talk today was determined by today's date. 39 years ago, my parents took a package of documents to an office in Moscow. This was our application for an exit visa to leave the Soviet Union. More than 2 years would pass before the application was granted, but from that day on, I have felt a sense of precariousness wherever I have been, along with a sense of opportunity. They are a pair. I have emigrated again as an adult, and I was even named a great immigrant this year, which I took to be an affirmation of my skill, attained through practice, though this was hardly what the honor was meant to convey. I have also raised kids of my own. If anything, with every new step I've taken, I've marveled more at the courage it would have required for my parents to step into the abyss. I remember seeing them in the kitchen poring over a copy of an atlas of the world. For them, America was an outline on a page, a web of thin purplish lines. They'd read a few American books, had seen a handful of Hollywood movies. A friend was fond of asking them jokingly whether they could really be sure that the West even existed. Truthfully, they couldn't know. They did know that if they left the Soviet Union, they would never be able to return. Like many things we accept as rare certainties, this one turned out to be wrong. They would have to make a home elsewhere. And I think that worked for them. As Jews, they never felt at home in the Soviet Union. And when home is not where you're born, nothing is predetermined. Anything can be. So my parents always maintained that they viewed their leap into the unknown as an adventure. I wasn't so sure. After all, no one had asked me. 2, vulnerable. As a 13-year-old, I found myself in a clearing in the wood outside of Moscow at a secret, one might say underground, though it was out in the open, gathering of Jewish cultural activists. They sang songs. People went up in front of the crowd, 1, 2, or several at a time, with guitars and without, and sang from a limited repertoire of Hebrew and Yiddish songs. That is, they actually sang the same songs over and over again. But the tunes scraped something inside of me, making an organ I didn't know I had, located just above the breastbone, tingle with a sense of belonging. I was surrounded by strangers, sitting as we were on logs laid across the grass, and I remember their faces to this day. I looked at them and thought, this is who I am. That this, in this, was Jewish. For my first 37 years later, I'd add in a secular cultural community and in the Soviet Union, but back then, space was too small to require elaboration, and everything about it seemed self-evident. Like once I knew what I was, I would just be it. In fact, the people in front of me singing those songs were trying to figure out how to be Jewish in a country that had erased Jewishness. I'd like to think now that watching people learning to inhabit an identity was the thing that made me tingle. In autobiographical books written by exiles, the moment of emigration is often addressed in the first few pages, regardless of where it fell in a writer's life. And actually, that sentence is an artifact, because after I wrote it, I went to Vladimir Nabokov's Speak Memory to look for the relevant quote in its familiar place, and it took me about an hour, because it actually was on page 250 out of 310. But to me, it frames the whole book. And here's the phrase: "The break in my own destiny affords me, in retrospect, a syncopal kick that I would not have missed for worlds." This is an often quoted phrase in a book full of quotable sentences. The cultural critic and my late friend Svetlana Boym analyzed Nabokov's application of the word syncope, which has three distinct uses. In linguistics, it's the shortening of a word by omission of a sound or syllable from its middle. In music, it's a change of rhythm and shift of accent when a normally weak beat is stressed. And in medicine, it is the brief loss of consciousness. Syncope, wrote Svetlana, is the opposite of symbol and synthesis. Suketu Mehta, in his Maximum City, wrote, "Each person's life is dominated by a central event, which shapes and distorts everything that comes after it, and in retrospect, everything that came before. For me, it was going to live in America at the age of 14. It's a difficult age at which to change countries. You haven't quite finished growing up where you were, and you're never well in your skin in the one you're moving to." Mehta didn't let me down. This assertion appears in the very first pages of his magnificent book. Also, he moved to America at the same age as I did. And while I think that he might be wrong about everyone, I am certain that he is right about emigres. The break colors everything that came before and after. Svetlana Boym, had a private theory. She thought that an emigre's life continues in the land left behind. You can't access it, but it's there. It's a parallel story. In an unpublished piece, she tried to imagine the parallel lives of her Soviet, Russian, Jewish, left behind self. And toward the end of her life, this retracing and reimagining became something of an obsession. She also had a theory about me, that I had gone back to reclaim a life that had been interrupted. In any case, there are many stories to be told about a single life. Three, diversity. On Valentine's Day in 1982, I was 15, I went to a gay dance at Yale. This was a great time for gay dances. It was no longer terrifying to be queer on campus, but gay life was still half hidden in a way that was thrilling. I do not remember, in fact, dancing, and I don't even remember catching anyone's eye. In other words, I'm pretty sure that no one noticed me. And strangely, that wasn't crushing, because what I do remember is standing somewhere dark, leaning against something, and feeling like I was surrounded by community. I remember thinking, this is who I could be. And what the syncope of emigration had meant for me was the difference between discovering who I was, the experience I had in the woods outside of Moscow, and discovering who I could be, the experience I had at that dance. It was a moment of choice, and thanks to the break in my destiny, I was aware of it. 4, entitlement. In this sense, my personal narrative splits from that of the American gay and lesbian movement. The latter was based on choicelessness. A choice may have to be defended. Certainly, one has to be prepared to defend one's right to make a choice. While arguing that you were born this way appeals to other people's sympathy, or at least their sense of decency. It also serves to quell one's own doubts into foreclosed future options. We are mostly comfortable with less choice, much as I would have felt safer if my parents had not set out on their great emigration adventure. After I left Moscow, my grandmother was compelled to hide the fact of our emigration. We had committed an act of treason that could have threatened those left behind. So in the little town where she lived and where I had spent summers as a child, she continued to update my friends on the life I wasn't leading. In that Soviet life, I applied to colleges and failed to get in. In the end, I settled for some mediocre-sounding technical route. I was hurt by the predictability of the story my grandmother chose for me. In the United States, I was living an imaginative and risky life. I dropped out of high school. I ran away from home. I lived in the East Village. I worked as a bicycle messenger. I dropped out of college. I worked in the gay press. I got arrested at ACT UP protests. I experimented sexually and romantically. I behaved abhorrently. I was sometimes a good friend. But in the mirror held up by my grandmother, it wasn't just my location that was different. It was the presence of choice in my life. With every step that my grandmother invented for me, my choices closed in on me. And after 10 years in this country, I went back to Moscow as a journalist on assignment. It was a jarring experience. I felt uncomfortably, I felt actually unexpectedly comfortable, uncomfortably comfortable, in a country that I had expected to feel foreign. It was almost like slipping into a place in the air that had my outline all along. And that made me resentful about not having had a choice in leaving. So I kept going back and eventually stayed, refashioning myself as a Russian language journalist. I pretended that this was the life I would have had if I had never left. But deep inside, I believed that my grandmother had been right, that there was a parallel me toiling miserably on some dead-end engineering task. And this made me a double imposter in the life I was living. I'm not sure when I made the decision to stay in Russia, but I remember hearing the statement come out of my mouth, surprising me, as that sometimes happens. It had been a year since I started living there, and I was talking to a close friend, an American graduate student, who had also been there a year and was now going back. "I think I'm going to stay," I said. "Of course you are," he responded, as though it weren't a choice at all. And around the same time, a Russian journalist asked me how I felt more comfortable, being a Russian in America or an American in Russia. And I was incensed. I thought, well, I said, "How dare you ask me this question? I am a Russian in Russia and an American in America." And it was many, many years before I actually came to like the idea of being a Russian in America and an American in Russia. Meanwhile, I re-met my two grandmothers, whom I hadn't seen since I was a teenager, and I started interviewing them. And this project became a book about the choices they had made. One had become a censor. She told me that becoming a censor had been a moral choice. She had been educated to be a history teacher. And she said that by the time she graduated from university, she realized that she couldn't face lying to children every day. And so she got a job as a censor. In her universe, a censor was somebody who carried out plainly stated orders. Her personality, her self, was not involved in crossing out other people's words. Or her first job as a censor was actually reading other people's mail and making sure that the mail that wasn't supposed to get through to people didn't get through to them. She felt that was an automatic job. Anyone in her place would have done it exactly the same as she did it. Whereas lying to children was something that she would have done with a particular gift for it, and it would have been immoral. My other grandmother, I had always known as a rebel and a dissident. In the family, there was a sort of myth of these two tracks. One grandmother was a member of the Communist Party, and a conformist. She was the one who had worked as a censor, and the other never did anything that she was ordered to do. And in interviewing her, I discovered that she had agreed to take a job with the secret police when it was offered to her. She told me that it had been no choice at all. She had to feed her child and she could get no other work. She never started the job because she failed a medical exam. But the central figure in the book was my great-grandfather, who was killed in Majdanek. I had always known that he had helped in the rebellion in the Białystok ghetto. But then I also found out that he had served in the Judenrat before choosing to start helping the rebels. And I looked at all the documents that had been preserved in from the Białystok ghetto, and there was actually a fair amount of information on the actions of the Judenrat. It appeared that my great-grandfather was the de facto leader of the Judenrat. The Judenrat had a sort of a figurehead, a venerated rabbi, but my great-grandfather was running things. Before the war, he had been a member of the City Council of Białystok and of the Jewish Council of Białystok, and so it seemed logical that he served in what was the local governance in the ghetto. I found memoirs by the leaders of the Białystok ghetto rebellion that talked about how he had tried to stop them from organizing a rebellion before realizing that he could no longer guarantee the survival of anybody in the ghetto, or anybody at all in the ghetto, right? And joining them and starting to arrange for arms to be brought into the ghetto to help them. But before that, it would appear that he had actually taken part and possibly authored extermination lists. My grandmother didn't want me to publish this part. In particular, actually, she didn't want me to quote Hannah Arendt's opinion on the Judenrat as written in Eichmann in Jerusalem, the manuscript of which we just looked at in this library. And we had a protracted battle that threatened to become a legal battle over whose story it was to tell. His life story, whether it was hers or mine or both of ours. I saw it as a story of impossible, anguished choices that my great-grandfather nonetheless insisted on making. Totalitarian regimes aim to make choice impossible. And this was what interested me at the time. I was awed by the gap between my capacity for judgment and the limited options faced by my grandparents. I fixated on the ideas of impossible choice and no choice at all. Now I find that something else interests me, that resistance can take the shape of insisting on making a choice, even when it's a choice between unacceptable options. 5, science-based. Back in the United States, my parents' adventure came to a halt. My mother died of cancer in the summer of 1992. Another 11 years later, I returned for a year-long fellowship to be a Russian in America for a year. During that year, I took a test that showed I had the genetic mutation that had caused the cancer that killed my mother and her aunt before that. I was born this way, born to develop cancer of the breasts or ovaries, or both. The genetic counselors and doctors asked me what I wanted to do. It was a choice, framed as one between monitoring for aggressive monitoring for the first signs of cancer, which they said were certain to come, or preventive surgery. And I ended up writing about this first a series of articles and then a book on making choices in the age of genetic testing. I talked to people who had faced far more drastic choices than the one before me. These people had chosen to live without such essential organs as a stomach or the pancreas, whereas all the doctors were suggesting to me was the removal of breasts and ovaries. I chose to remove my breasts and reconstruct them. I was choosing my breast size and my fate. The doctors, incidentally, didn't think this was the right choice. They advocated for the removal of the ovaries rather than, or more importantly than, the breasts. I found more compelling evidence in favor of keeping the ovaries for a while, but 2.5 years ago, I had those removed as well. Around that time, my doctor was strongly suggesting I really no longer had a choice. 6, transgender. After 2 decades in Russia, I left again. It was one of those impossible choices that don't feel like much of a choice. I was one of many people pushed out of the country during the crackdown. Some were given the choice between emigrating or going to prison. My options were emigrating or seeing social services go after my kids on the ground that I am queer. What had happened to the life of my discontinuous self, what had happened to the life that my discontinuous self was leading back in America while I was in Russia? My writing life had been proceeding apace, more or less. I was publishing in the United States while living in Russia. But socially, who was I? Who were my people? Where did I belong? I had lost some friends and gained others. Some friends had become couples, split up, recoupled, had children. I had coupled and recoupled and had children too. Also, some of the women I had known had become men. That's not the way most transgender people phrase it. The default language is one of choicelessness. People say that they had always been men or women, and now their authentic selves were emerging. It's a similar rhetoric of choicelessness that the LGBT movement had been using to great political effect while I was gone. It had gotten queer people access to such institutions as the military and marriage. And the standard story goes something like this. As a child, I always felt like a boy or never felt like a girl, and then I tried to be a lesbian, but the issue wasn't sexual orientation, it was gender, specifically true gender, which could now be claimed through transitioning. I found myself feeling resentful at hearing these stories. I too had always felt like a boy. It had taken some work for me to enjoy being a woman. I had learned how to be one, whatever that means. I'd succeeded, but still, here I was, faced with the possibility that in the parallel life that my left-behind self was leading in the United States while I was in Russia, I would have transitioned. True gender, whatever that means, didn't have much to do with it, but choice did. Somehow I'd missed the fact that it was there. I had written an entire book on making choices that had to do with removing the parts of the body that would appear to have made me female, the breasts, the ovaries, the uterus. And I had not questioned the assumptions that after a mastectomy, one considers one's options for reconstruction. And after a radical hysterectomy, one considers whether to receive hormone replacement in the form of estrogen. Indeed, I had had reconstruction and was taking estrogen. I had failed miserably at seeing my choices made as they were under some duress as an opportunity for adventure. I had failed to think about inhabiting a different body the way one would think about inhabiting a different country. How do I invent the person that I am now? So I quit estrogen and started testosterone. It was a thought process. I had to question the idea of replacement, this idea that there was something that sort of automatically accrued to someone who had lived as a woman. And I also was fascinated with the danger that seemed to attach to the option of testosterone, which is a hormone that actually female bodies naturally produce. I spent a long time looking at studies, which, as it turned out, studies of women taking testosterone, which, as it turns out, fall into two categories. Studies that aim to assure people that they will, in fact, experience all the masculinizing changes that they want to experience, and studies that aim to assure women that they will not experience any masculinizing changes because they don't want to. I'm taking a low dose, and so I have no idea how it's going to affect me because the studies don't address that specifically. My voice has become lower, my body is changing, but then again, bodies change all the time. In her book, The Argonauts, Maggie Nielsen quotes her partner, the artist Harry Dodge, as saying that he's not going anywhere, not transitioning, but being himself. Somehow, that sentiment is familiar to me, although I'd probably flip it. For 39 years today, ever since my parents took those documents to the visa office, I have felt so precarious that I lay no claim to someone I really am. That someone is a sequence of choices. And the question is, will your next choice be conscious? And will your ability to make it be unfettered? 7, evidence-based. It took little effort to organize the notes I had jotted down for this talk around the 7 words that the Trump administration has banned the Centers for Disease Control from using. All 7 words, from fetus to evidence-based, are words that reflect on our understanding of choice. Choice is a great burden. The call to invent one's life and to do it continuously can sound unbearable. Totalitarian regimes aim to stamp out the possibility of choice, but what aspiring autocrats do is promise to relieve one of the need to choose. This is the promise of Make America Great Again. It conjures the allure of an imaginary past in which one is free not to choose. It's interesting that in the last year, since Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism and George Orwell's 1984 have enjoyed such renewed popularity and well-deserved, there's actually a book that I'm surprised people aren't reading more, and that's Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom. It's a beautiful little book that he published in 1940. It has an introduction in which he apologizes for the book being hastily written and kind of sloppy, because he writes that he felt an urgency about getting it out there because he feels that the world is on the verge of catastrophe. 1940. And the model that he suggests is that there are 2 kinds of freedom. There's freedom from, which you all want. We all want our parents to stop telling us what to do. And there's freedom to invent oneself, freedom to create a future, freedom to make choices. He suggests that there are certain periods in history when the freedom to becomes unbearable for a critical number of people, and a critical number of people long to hand over their freedom to someone who will make the choices for them, whether it's Martin Luther, Adolf Hitler, or someone else. I should say, actually, that Erich Fromm is enjoying a resurgence in among mental health professionals, because he's also the author of the concept of malignant narcissism. But I'm taken with his idea of freedom too, and his thinking on the imaginary past and the appeal of the imaginary past as a place where you don't have to choose. And so I find myself not wondering at all at the fact that Trump appears to be obsessed with people who embody choice. Immigrants are his most frightening imaginary enemy, the ones who need to be extremely vetted. It's a little bit like every time I hear that phrase, I actually think of the aggressive monitoring that I was supposed to do for cancer. It seems as lethal and as inevitable as cancer in that rhetoric. People who need to be blocked out with the wall, people whose crimes need to be reported to a special hotline and whose families need to be kept out of this country. Transgender people seem to be another target of his apparently spontaneous lashing out. Whether it's the transgender ban in the military or the inclusion of the word transgender on this list. And I find it interesting that in speaking about immigrants, we also tend to privilege choicelessness, much as we do when we're speaking about queer people or transgender people. We focus on the distinction between refugees and economic migrants. without asking why the fear of hunger and the fear of hunger and destitution qualifies as a lesser reason for migration than the fear of imprisonment or death by gunshot wound. And then only if that wound is inflicted for political or religious reasons. But even more than that, why do we assume that the more restricted a person's choices have been, the more qualified they are to enter a country that proclaims freedom of personal choice to be one of its ideals? I also am always mindful of the random chance that my parents had at their great adventure. For some reason, Jews leaving the Soviet Union were considered to be refugees. There were many other ethnic groups and religious groups in the Soviet Union who were marginalized, discriminated against, systematically oppressed. There are ethnic and religious groups in Russia now that are being bombed out of existence or imprisoned, and yet through an accident of a very well-organized and very sympathetic Jewish community in the United States, through the fact that there were many articulate and courageous activists in the Soviet Union. And by courageous, I mean, willing to try to hijack a plane, which was the first event that drew attention to the struggle of Soviet Jews to emigrate. For those reasons, we became known as political refugees rather than economic migrants or some other kind of migrants. But actually, I think that was testimony to the insistence of the ability of Soviet Jews to secure the right to emigrate, the ability of Soviet Jews to secure the status of political refugees was testimony to their insistence on making a choice. Immigrants make a choice, and the valor, I think, is not being at risk for catching a bullet, but in making the choice to avoid it. This is actually something that Soviet dissidents maintained for a long time. It was a basic principle that if you have the choice between going to prison and leaving the country, you should always leave the country. There's nothing heroic about placing yourself in a position where you will not be free to act. Less dramatically, the choice is in being able, the valor is in being able to experience your move less as an escape and more as an adventure. It is in serving as living reminders of the choicefulness of life, something that immigrants and most trans people do, whether their personal narratives are ones of choice or not. And I wish I could finish with something hopeful. About how if we just make choices, if we just insist on our ability to make a choice, it will all work out. I'm not sure that's true. I am quite certain, though, that that's the only possible avenue of resistance. That, or to make it less dramatic, it's the only possible way to survive with your sanity intact, is to try to not just make choices when life feels choiceless, but to imagine better choices, to imagine better in general, and see a wider set of options like I have sometimes failed to do, and to choose again and choose better. Thank you.